And that's when the Pentagon audit leaked. December 2025. An internal Defense Logistics Agency report, never meant for public consumption, showed that the U.S. strategic silver stockpile has fallen from 286 million ounces in 1980 to just 31 million ounces today. An 89% decline in national defense silver reserves, while weapon systems have become more dependent on the metal than ever before in history. And buried on page 47 of that leaked document was a single line that should have triggered congressional hearings immediately. Each AGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missile requires 47 ounces of silver in guidance systems, radar components, and electrical contacts. 47 ounces. At current production rates of 2,000 Tomahawk missiles per year, that's 94,000 ounces of silver consumption annually just for one weapon system. Now multiply that across the entire U.S. military arsenal. F-35 fighter jets, Aegis destroyer radar systems, satellite networks, missile defense batteries, electronic warfare platforms, and classified weapons programs that consume silver in quantities the public will never know. The United States military, the most advanced and lethal fighting force ever assembled, is running out of the critical material that makes modern precision warfare possible, and almost nobody is talking about it. Let me show you exactly how we got here, why this is far more dangerous than a simple supply shortage, and what happens when America's enemies realize the U.S. cannot replenish its arsenal without silver that no longer exists in sufficient quantities. Here's the framework for understanding what silver actually does in military applications, because this isn't about coins or jewelry. This is about the fundamental physics that make 21st century weapons work. Silver is the most electrically conductive element on Earth. Better than copper, better than gold, better than anything. When you need to move an electrical signal with zero loss, minimal resistance, and perfect reliability in extreme conditions, high G-forces, temperature extremes, electromagnetic interference, you use silver. In a Tomahawk missile, silver is everywhere. The guidance system uses silver-plated contacts in its ring laser gyroscope, which allows the missile to navigate to within 10 meters of its target after traveling 1,500 miles. Silver solders connect critical circuit boards that must maintain connections, while the missile experiences launch acceleration that would destroy inferior materials. Silver brazing joins radar components that must function flawlessly in the final seconds before impact. Every single one of those applications requires silver, not because it's traditional or preferred, but because nothing else works as well. You cannot substitute copper in a guidance system that must maintain micron-level precision while spinning at thousands of RPMs in sub-zero temperatures at supersonic speeds. The physics don't allow it, and it's not just Tomahawks. An F-35 Lightning II fighter jet, America's most advanced stealth aircraft, contains an estimated 800 to 1,000 ounces of silver. That's nearly 70 pounds of silver per aircraft in radar arrays, avionics, electrical systems, and the ejection seat alone. The U.S. military plans to acquire 2,456 F-35s. That's potentially 2 million ounces of silver demand just for this one aircraft program. Aegis-class destroyers, the backbone of U.S. naval air defense, use SPY-1 radar systems that require approximately 5,000 ounces of silver per ship in waveguides, phase shifters, and power distribution systems. Each destroyer costs $1.8 billion, and that radar system absolutely requires silver to function. There is no alternative that provides the same performance. Satellite systems, GPS, communications, reconnaissance, use silver-zinc batteries because they have the highest energy density of any battery chemistry and can operate in the vacuum of space for years. A single military reconnaissance satellite can require 500 to 1,000 ounces of silver in batteries and electronic components. Add it all up across the entire Department of Defense procurement budget, and you're looking at millions of ounces of silver consumption annually just to maintain current readiness levels, before you even factor in wartime surge production. Now, here's the crisis. That 31 million ounce strategic stockpile represents about 11 months of military silver consumption at current peacetime rates. Not years, months. And that assumes you don't need to ramp up production in a war, which would multiply consumption by a factor of 5 or 10. To put that in perspective, during World War II, the United States borrowed 300 million ounces of silver from the Treasury Department to use in Manhattan Project calutrons, electromagnetic isotope separators needed to enrich uranium for the atomic bomb. The entire bomb program would have failed without that silver. The U.S. had 300 million ounces available to lend in 1942. Today, the strategic stockpile is one-tenth that size, while weapon systems consume silver at rates that would have been unimaginable 80 years ago. Let me show you exactly how the stockpile disappeared, because this wasn't a gradual decline. This was a policy decision that turned out to be catastrophically short-sighted. In 1980, the U.S. Defense National Stockpile held 286 million ounces of silver, accumulated during the Cold War as a strategic reserve for defense production. Silver was recognized as a critical material necessary for national security, and the stockpile was meant to ensure the U.S. could sustain weapons production even if global supply chains were disrupted. But in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, defense planners made a fateful assumption. The era of great power conflict was over. The end of history had arrived. The U.S. would face only regional conflicts and counterterrorism operations. Large-scale conventional war requiring industrial mobilization was obsolete. Based on that assumption, the decision was made to sell off the strategic silver stockpile. Why maintain expensive inventories of a commodity when you can buy it on the open market whenever you need it? The proceeds from selling silver could fund other priorities. And besides, global silver production was stable. Supply was abundant. There was no risk. So, between 1990 and 2005, the U.S. government sold approximately 255 million ounces of silver from the strategic stockpile into the open market. At an average price of around $5 to $7 per ounce, the government collected roughly $1.5 billion. They sold the strategic silver reserve. The insurance policy meant to guarantee the U.S. could build weapons in a great power war for $1.5 billion. The current U.S. defense budget is $850 billion annually. We sold 80 years' worth of strategic silver for less than 1 week's worth of Pentagon spending. And here's the irony that should make every military strategist sick. That silver was sold into a market where much of it was purchased by China, which was simultaneously building its own strategic stockpile of critical materials in preparation for exactly the kind of great power competition U.S. planners assumed was extinct. China now holds an estimated 30,000 to 50,000 tons of various strategic materials stockpiled since the 1990s. The U.S. sold off its stockpiles. China bought them up, and now, 30 years later, we're in a strategic competition with a near-peer adversary that controls more critical materials than we do. The 31 million ounces that remain in the U.S. strategic stockpile represent what was left after the selling binge ended around 2005. And even that remnant has been quietly drawn down over the past 20 years to meet military production needs, with minimal replenishment. Why minimal replenishment? Because refilling the stockpile would require purchasing tens of millions of ounces of silver on the open market, which would spike prices and reveal to adversaries that the U.S. has a critical vulnerability in defense supply chains. So instead, the Pentagon has been drawing down the stockpile slowly, hoping nobody notices, while becoming more and more dependent on global silver markets controlled increasingly by countries that are not allies. Now, let me show you why this matters strategically, because the implications go far beyond silver prices. In a Taiwan conflict scenario, which every Pentagon wargame now considers the most likely flashpoint for great power war, the U.S. would need to rapidly expand production of precision-guided munitions, anti-ship missiles, air defense interceptors, and electronic warfare systems, all of which consume silver. Estimates suggest the U.S. would expend 5,000-plus precision-guided missiles in the first month of a Taiwan conflict alone. At 30 to 50 ounces of silver per missile on average, that's 150,000 to 250,000 ounces of silver consumption in 30 days of combat. And the conflict wouldn't end in 30 days. A protracted conflict could require production of 30,000 to 50,000 missiles over 12 to 18 months. That's 1.5 million to 2.5 million ounces of silver demand just for missile production, not including aircraft, ships, satellites, and other systems lost in combat that would need replacement. Where would that silver come from? The 31 million ounce stockpile would be depleted in less than 2 years of sustained conflict at those consumption rates. After that, the US would be dependent on purchasing silver from global markets. But here's the problem. China produces about 110 million ounces of silver annually, roughly 12% of global production. China also consumes nearly all of its domestic production for industrial purposes, primarily electronics and solar panels. In a conflict with the US, does anyone believe China would export silver to America? Peru produces about 120 million ounces annually, the largest producer in the world. Mexico produces about 190 million ounces. Together, Latin America represents about 50% of global silver production. These countries would face enormous pressure from China, their largest trading partner, to restrict silver exports to the United States during a conflict. Even if Latin American producers remained neutral and continued selling to the US, there's the issue of price. In a wartime scenario where the US military is competing with Chinese industrial demand, silver prices could spike to $200, $300, or $500 per ounce. At those prices, the cost of weapons production becomes almost secondary to the question of whether you can secure supply at any price. Imagine if the limiting factor in US weapons production isn't money, manufacturing capacity, or manpower. It's access to 47 ounces of silver per Tomahawk missile. That's the strategic vulnerability we've created by selling off the stockpile. And here's where it gets even worse. Because adversaries know this, Chinese military intelligence has certainly analyzed US defense supply chains and identified critical dependencies. They know about the silver requirement in US weapon systems. They know the US sold off its strategic stockpile, and they're in a position to exploit that vulnerability. China could implement export restrictions on silver, not an outright ban, which would be too obvious, but quotas, licensing requirements, or environmental regulations that limit mine production and exports. This would tighten global silver supply, spike prices, and stress US defense procurement without China firing a single shot. Russia, which produces about 45 million ounces of silver annually, could coordinate with China to restrict supply further. Together, they could create a silver squeeze that achieves strategic effects, forcing the US to either pay exorbitant prices for silver, diverting defense budgets, or accept limits on weapons production. This is economic warfare at the level of critical materials, and because the US dismantled its strategic stockpile, we're vulnerable in ways we haven't been since before World War II. Now, let me show you the specific weapons systems that are most at risk, because this isn't theoretical. These are operational platforms that the US military depends on today. Tomahawk cruise missiles. These are the backbone of US long-range strike capability. The Navy has approximately 4,000 Tomahawks in inventory and uses them in every major conflict. At 47 ounces per missile, that's 188,000 ounces of silver in the current inventory. But more importantly, replacing combat losses would require continuous production drawing from increasingly tight silver supplies. SM-3 and SM-6 missiles. These are the interceptors that defend US ships and bases from ballistic missiles and aircraft. Each missile contains an estimated 35 to 50 ounces of silver in seekers, guidance systems, and electronic components. The US maintains an inventory of several thousand interceptors, but in a high-intensity conflict, these would be expended rapidly. A single carrier strike group could fire 100-plus interceptors in a major engagement. JASSM and LRASM missiles. Joint air-to-surface standoff missiles and long-range anti-ship missiles are critical for penetrating advanced air defenses and attacking ships at range. Silver content is classified, but based on the complexity of their guidance and targeting systems, estimates run between 40 and 60 ounces per missile. These are exactly the weapons the US would rely on in a Taiwan scenario. AMRAAM and Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. Every US fighter carries these for air combat. Silver in radar seekers and fusing systems is essential for reliability. The U.S. inventory includes tens of thousands of these missiles, but combat attrition in a peer conflict could require production of thousands per month to sustain operations. Satellite constellations. The U.S. military depends on GPS, communications, and reconnaissance satellites, all of which use silver-zinc batteries and silver-plated components. Replacing satellites destroyed by Chinese anti-satellite weapons would require silver measured in thousands of ounces per replacement. Next-generation systems. Hypersonic missiles, directed energy weapons, advanced electronic warfare systems. All of these emerging technologies are even more dependent on silver than legacy systems because they require more sophisticated electronics and higher performance under extreme conditions. The more advanced U.S. weapons become, the more silver they consume, and the more vulnerable the entire military becomes to silver supply disruptions. Let me show you what this looks like in dollar terms because the financial implications are staggering. A Tomahawk missile costs approximately $1.5 million to produce. The 47 ounces of silver in that missile at current COMEX prices around $68 per ounce represents about $3,200 in material costs, roughly 0.2% of the total missile cost. Trivial. But if silver prices spike to $300 per ounce during a conflict due to supply constraints, that same 47 ounces now costs $14,100. Still only 1% of the missile cost, so not a huge factor in unit economics. The problem isn't the cost, the problem is availability. At $300 per ounce, silver producers would redirect supply to industrial users who pay cash immediately. Defense contractors working on government contracts with fixed prices and payment delays would be outbid. The U.S. military would find itself in a position where it has unlimited money to build missiles, but can't acquire the silver needed to build them. This is the nightmare scenario for defense logistics. Not running out of money, but running out of materials. And it's a scenario the United States hasn't faced since World War II, when the government had to ration copper, aluminum, and other critical metals. Except in World War II, the U.S. had a 300 million ounce silver stockpile to draw from. Today, we have 31 million ounces, and unlike in the 1940s when the U.S. was the world's largest producer of almost everything, today China controls global manufacturing supply chains for most critical materials. Now, here's the part that should terrify Pentagon planners, because this vulnerability isn't limited to silver. It extends across the entire periodic table of elements critical for defense production. Rare earth elements. 17 metals essential for magnets and missile guidance systems, jet engines, and electronics. China controls 70% of global production and 90% of global refining capacity. The U.S. has almost no domestic rare earth supply chain. Cobalt, critical for high-performance batteries and superalloys in jet engines. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces 70% of global supply, and Chinese companies control most of that production through ownership of mines and refineries. Lithium, essential for batteries in everything from soldier portable electronics to electric drive systems in ships and vehicles. China controls over 60% of global lithium refining capacity. Tungsten, used in armor-piercing munitions and high-temperature applications. China produces 80% of global supply. The United States has allowed itself to become dependent on foreign, often adversarial supply chains for nearly every critical material needed for defense production. And silver is just the most visible example because the stockpile drawdown was so dramatic. The Defense Production Act theoretically gives the U.S. government authority to compel domestic production of critical materials and prioritize military procurement. But you can't compel production that doesn't exist. There are no dormant silver mines in the U.S. waiting to be reactivated. Most silver is produced as a byproduct of copper, lead, and zinc mining, and increasing production would require expanding base metal mining. A process that takes years and requires permitting that environmental regulations make extremely difficult. Even if the U.S. could somehow double domestic silver production overnight, it would only yield about 35 million additional ounces annually, not nearly enough to both replenish the strategic stockpile and support surge weapons production in a major conflict. The hard truth is that the United States gave up strategic autonomy in critical materials in exchange for short-term cost savings and environmental offshoring, letting other countries do the dirty work of mining and refining while we imported the finished products. That worked fine in an era of globalization and great power peace. It's catastrophic in an era of strategic competition and potential great power war. Let me show you what the Pentagon's options are now, because none of them are good. Option 1. Attempt to rebuild the strategic stockpile. This would require purchasing 250 plus million ounces of silver on the open market over several years, roughly $17 billion at current prices, potentially $50 billion plus if the buying itself spikes prices. This would be visible to adversaries, signal vulnerability, and potentially trigger preemptive hoarding by China and Russia. Option 2. Develop substitutes for silver in weapon systems. Research is ongoing into carbon nanotube conductors and other advanced materials, but none have matched silver's performance in real-world military applications. Even if substitutes are found, redesigning and requalifying weapon systems would take a decade or more. You can't swap out materials in a Tomahawk guidance system without essentially designing a new missile. Option 3. Accept the vulnerability and hope deterrence prevents conflict. This is implicitly the current strategy. The U.S. maintains just enough stockpile to sustain current operations and low-intensity conflicts, gambling that a great power war won't happen before supply chain issues can be addressed. Option 4. Negotiate supply agreements with allied producers. The U.S. could attempt to secure long-term silver supply contracts with Mexico, Peru, Canada, and Australia, the major non-Chinese producers. But these agreements would need to include wartime guarantees, which would be politically sensitive and might not survive a crisis where these countries face economic coercion from China. None of these options fully address the problem, and all of them require years to implement. The U.S. is strategically vulnerable right now, today, in ways that cannot be quickly fixed, and here's the final element that makes this truly dangerous. Adversaries can exploit this vulnerability without firing a shot. If China wanted to pressure the U.S. over Taiwan without triggering direct military conflict, they could simply implement silver export restrictions, cite environmental or resource conservation concerns, and watch U.S. defense procurement costs spike while production timelines stretch. This would achieve strategic effects, limiting U.S. ability to sustain a protracted conflict while staying below the threshold of war. Russia could coordinate similar restrictions. Together, they could engineer a silver squeeze that forces the U.S. to either back down in a crisis or accept entering a conflict with limited ability to replace weapons expended in combat. This is hybrid warfare at the level of industrial supply chains. And because the U.S. sold off its strategic stockpile, we're vulnerable in ways previous generations of military planners would have considered unthinkable. Look, I'm not a defense analyst. I'm not a government official. I'm showing you information that leaked from an internal Pentagon logistics assessment that revealed an 89% decline in strategic silver reserves, while weapon systems have become more dependent on silver than ever before. 47 ounces per Tomahawk missile might not sound like much. But multiply that across an entire modern military arsenal, factor in the possibility of sustained conflict with a peer adversary, and recognize that the U.S. has only 31 million ounces in reserve, while China controls much of global production, and you start to see the strategic nightmare. The United States cannot fight a protracted war against China without secure access to silver, and right now, that access is anything but secure. The Pentagon knows this. That's why the assessment was conducted, but the solutions require political will, massive investment, and years of implementation. Meanwhile, the vulnerability exists today, and if adversaries understand this vulnerability, they will exploit it, not necessarily through direct conflict, but through economic coercion, market manipulation, and strategic positioning that makes the U.S. think twice before committing to defend Taiwan or any other flashpoint. When historians look back at how the United States lost its military technological edge, they won't point to a single battle or failed weapons program. They'll point to the decision to sell off the strategic silver stockpile for $1.5 billion in the 1990s while simultaneously making every advanced weapon system dependent on that exact material. And they'll point to the moment when it became clear that the most powerful military in history couldn't build enough missiles to fight a war because it didn't have 47 ounces of silver per unit. That moment is now.